That's a really good question, Julia. And I have bad news and I have good news. So, starting with the bad news, as Nobel Peace Prize winner Maria Ressa says, when you don't have facts, you can't have truth. And when you don't have truth, you can't have trust. And when you don't have a shared reality, you can't have democracy. Luckily, there is also good news. Life is more than social media. Offline, the earth is still round, the sun is still warm, rain is still wet, and grass is still green. This is why it's so important to keep meeting people offline and to have genuine conversations that are not distorted by algorithms. We need to keep using our social muscles, so to say, not only because it's so much nicer to be around real humans, but also to maintain a shared reality and to preserve democracy.
Well, thank you for the question, Julia. I think it's only a post-truth world if we let it become one. And your question is very pertinent because I think it's vitally important to remember that without there's no accountability without truth, and there's no democracy without accountability. So we need to stand up for the truth. We must defend the truth, and I think consider the most authoritarian leaders, the most authoritarian rulers in history. They didn't first go after minorities and others. They first attacked the truth, and then they attacked more vulnerable people after that. And so I think that's the thing, is it's a leading sign of authoritarians is when they really want to attack the truth. So I think defending the truth and standing up for truth are vital to defending democracy.
Well, I have to say, dear Klaus, that sadly I agree with you. Our information space is broken. And we humans have created a so-called information disorder. We have a structural, systemic problem which we need to fix as soon as possible. What is happening is that humanity is now inventing and deploying technologies that transform our societies in ways that we cannot handle. Our brains can't cope, and we as social creatures can't cope. I can say much more about this because there's so many aspects to this problem. It's very complex. There are no silver bullets, and but yes, the problem is very, very urgent, and I think our governments really should take this more seriously and speed up because our democracies are at stake.
Thank you, Klaus. You paint quite a dark picture, but not an inaccurate one. I think it's important to remember that any of these new tools, social media, newspapers, when they come out, were thought to be dangerous. Any of these new tools, we can either use them for good or they can be used for malign purposes. And I think it's sort of, if we have to be paying attention and govern them accordingly, and not sort of just let the genie out of the bottle and see what happens, and then try to recapture it and bring, put a legal regime around it and some norms and practices around it. And I think that's what's happening with social media. We just sort of let the genie out of the bottle, and now we're trying to put it back in. I think it's important to remember that in today's media environment and the way advertisers and social media companies work, obviously, if you don't pay for the service, you are the product. And so outrage is profitable. So the more extreme views that are out there, the more engagement they get, the more data they collect on us, the more they can charge to advertisers to advertise to us. So there's a couple things that I think are really important to unpackage here, and I'm going to do that. First is, it's so much more than the algorithm. It's that we are being manipulated into feeding the algorithm every time we go on social media. We are being pressure to make up our mind and have an opinion about so many things that we normally would not. I mean, what flavor of gum? How do you feel about, this football side? I don't pick anything, and they're always constantly forcing you to choose something or like something or dislike something so that they can refine their micro-targeting picture of you. And so I think part of it is, we're giving that away a little too easily. I think it's very important in today's world for people to realize you do not need to have an opinion about everything, and you do not need to make up your mind about every infinitesimal thing every moment of the day, because that is what social media forces us to do. That is what it's rewiring our brains in a way that I don't think we're prepared for. And I think that's a big part of it. And I think also, it's so much, think about, especially during the pandemic, people living sort of in our little capsule lives, or atomized lives, is rebuilding human connections, real human connections in communities where you can really talk to people in person. The knitting circle, the Sunday football side, all these sorts of, even sitting at the pub with your friends, talking about things, and having real human exchanges. I hate to say it, but people have kind of forgotten how to do that. I know coming out of the pandemic, some of us did, but I think that's the most important one. Is it's more than the algorithm. It's so much more than that. And I think, it's also important to remember, look how much effort it took for the EU to agree on a code of conduct for social media companies, but it's purely voluntary. They don't have to do any of it. And so I think this is where I think the focus should be not on the producers, but the consumers. We need to focus on ourselves and how we can not be manipulated and gamified into feeding that algorithm, feeding the outrage. And I'll have some more things on that coming out in a few months, but I'll leave it at that. But I think it is a different cognitive environment we're living and operating in. It's a different environment in which we receive information and exchange information. And I think understanding how that impacts us and rewires our brain. I think, to paraphrase some people on the other side of the sea, take back control of our own attention is a big part of it. Now, I know it's simple to say. Again, I'll have some more things on that coming out later, but how do you take back control of your attention? Watch this space.
It's a really good point from Yuao that education in general and skills like critical thinking, media literacy, and digital literacy in particular are an important part of the solution. But they are not the silver bullet. And Yuao is right that it's certainly not a short-term solution. In my view, the only way to solve the underlying systemic crisis of our broken information space is to disrupt the business model of the big tech digital platforms. Anything else is rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. And even the Digital Services Act, though it's a good step forward, is far from adequate. I think that there are two things that must be done simultaneously and that can create quicker results than education. One is that democracies must team up to regulate digital platforms, starting by banning bad algorithms. And the other is that democracies must team up to provide public service alternatives, which we can design together, government, private sector, and civil society, so that we can build in values and privacy and security by design. I think those, and even those solutions, obviously won't generate, it takes time to do it, and it won't generate results like within 1 week, but it will be faster than education.
Yes and no. And here's why. Education, I've been in so many dozens of these discussions with, different EU and NATO and national leaders, and it's always, we need more education. And then I'll turn around and go look at some online activity, and I'll see people who I know and respect with PhDs who are believing and sharing disinformation. So it's about something more than education. So again, I think understanding a lot of our education on critical thinking is designed for us to address an analog world, not a chaotic digital world. And so I think it's a matter of approach. And so, if you're Joe's age or my age, and you are, Joe, my interviewer, not Joao, and you are out here in this world, we were educated in an analog way to approach that. I would hope to believe, and I've seen some of the EU education products, and I've seen some of the classes on this in Greece and Finland, that they are educating very young people right now on how to approach a chaotic digital environment. But that doesn't help grandma, does it? That doesn't help, your uncle in Budapest, right? And so these are, I think, important is adult education, people who are already out of the school system. How do we inform people again? How do we inform people of what's happening to them in this cognitive space so that they can have more, exert more of their own personal will on their attention, so that they don't give their attention away too easily? And I think, neuroscience has told us that if we slow down on our reactions to these things, that we make better decisions. We're more likely to choose truth over untruth if we slow down. And I think what's important about this particular question from Joao on education is that right now we're living in an interactive media world. We're interacting now this way. We spend about 11 hours a day on electronic media, phones and laptops and whatnot. We are moving into an immersive digital environment with augmented reality glasses will replace your phone soon. Virtual reality headsets. We've got the metaverse. We're going to spend a lot of people will spend much of their lives in the metaverse. You may have to do your job in the metaverse. That is immersive. Immersive is much hard. In an immersive world, it is much more difficult to tell truth from untruth because you're being presented an alternate world. You're operating in an alternate world. And so I think we need to design education that enables us to prepare citizens and the workforce for an immersive digital environment, because I think that's a degree of difficulty far beyond what we have now. We could see even greater splits in a greater societal division if we allow it, because at the same time we can use these same tools to strengthen democracy, to strengthen our social connections with each other. So again, any one of these tools, how we use them, depends on whether or not we make a conscious decision that there's a new technology. Great. How can we make sure that it improves our social connections, that it builds our community, that it strengthens democracy and not weaken it?
Well, Andre, I really feel for you. I often have similar thoughts, but let me start by saying that, as you probably agree with, is that freedom of expression and opinion are a great good, and they are important values for democracies. But these freedoms are human rights. And for example, state propaganda outlets are not humans. And they're not news channels either. They are weapons of war. And, so there's a difference between one person who has a genuine opinion that may not be mainstream, and I may not agree with this person, but I will defend his or her right to have a different opinion. But it's something different when we're talking about state propaganda outlets, or when we are talking about coordinated disinformation campaigns. Then we're not talking about content, but about behavior. And this can and must be regulated. And I think in this context, it's also important to mention that we need to distinguish illegal content from harmful content. And a very relevant and timely reminder is that the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights outlaws the use of propaganda to promote war. So that is legally forbidden, and that's with the current war, Russia's war on Ukraine, and the propaganda they use. This is important to realize.
This is a really tough one, especially when we think about the fact that the EU Code of Conduct is voluntary. I did a study 2 years ago. I wanted to write a paper about how we could use the law in Europe to punish those who were spreading disinformation about the coronavirus and to see if maybe we could, basically show that they were a health threat or whatnot. And I have to tell you, I studied 22 countries' legal regimes, which was not easy. And it was extremely difficult to find any common thread. There were a number of hate speech laws that are on the books that, even those hate speech laws took decades to come to agreement to in the various parliaments. So I think taking a legal censorship approach is extreme. It takes an extreme amount of political capital for very small gains. What you end up reaching consensus on are very small things. And here's the pattern I've seen, is that, and again, social media, when the newspapers first came out, people thought that was dangerous. It's dangerous for people to have that much knowledge. It's dangerous for the people in the villages to know too much, right? So there's always been this sort of, a new means of spreading information comes out and it's seen as dangerous because we don't, we use it correctly, or we don't frame it correctly in our governance. But I think when it comes to communications, public communications that are truly dangerous, if you're telling children to drink bleach, if you're telling people to do something dangerous, yes, that's an obvious case. We do have, in that case, there are a number of laws in Europe on the books, in the legal regimes that address that. And I think that is sort of where the cliff, after that, there's a bit of a cliff, because if you have someone who is out there spreading divisive rhetoric that may not be directly dangerous, but over the longer term is dangerous, the longer term, some of, the hate speech against LGBTQIA people, against Muslims, against Roma, against all kinds of people. We have laws in the books for that, but even then, if you look at prosecutions, it's extremely difficult to prosecute someone for that unless you can show a ridiculously direct link to a violent action that took a life. I mean, that's the thing is, so what I'm trying to say is I appreciate where you're coming from with the question, but looking legally at how difficult that is to come anywhere close, I think we end up spending a lot of political capital and we don't make gains. This is why, for me, again, 2 years ago, I started that study. I never published on it because I never found any good answers. So I have a stack of stuff I looked up that I couldn't do anything with because it was frustrating. This is why I am in a real mood these days of thinking about how can we enable the consumers of information, because the producers are going to produce, they are going to produce good information, bad information. And how can we focus on empowering us, empowering our fellow citizens? I love the concept of information first responders in our communities, local leaders and other people who can sort of point out and say, that's wrong, that's not true. We've seen that already in the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I was watching all of this, and I was in communication with some of these information first responders in Sweden and Italy and Poland and Germany, who were debunking immediately. I mean, immediately they were not only debunking, but they had the technical know-how to go in and look at the timestamp and geolocation of photos and debunk immediately. And that's, I think the other one is really the people power aspect, that individual citizens now have technical capabilities and know-how that used to only belong to governments. And so I think, private individuals who care and civil society organizations like Bellingcat and others who are out there rapidly debunking, they move faster than governments. And I think that's not a bad thing. I think it's wonderful when they're doing it in that vein. So I think I'm not to not to say it's not a good idea to limit their ability of some of these platforms to and people to put out really terrible and hateful information, but seeing how our democracies work and how we make laws, I think we get more progress on this by focusing on consumers, focusing on what civil society can do, because we can have an immediate impact that way.